Indigenous practices of futuring are very, very diverse. I think is the first perspective I want to think about, especially because I think there's like 500 plus tribes just in the United States. And, this term indigenous is extremely broad and is used to do kind of the political international work that needs to be done in order to link small communities together to push back against oppressive state power. And so Seven Generations has kind of become a broad, maybe pan-Indian, we'd call it, term, and that does some of this work of trying to clarify complicated futuring, complicated time scale perspectives. And so Lakota people do use the English term seven generations colloquially. I'm also familiar with it strongly as an Ojibwe term. Um, and, I think a lot about what my cousin and colleague Corey Stover has to say about seven generations. And uh, that part of it is when you make decisions, and we talk about ethics. When I talk about ethics, I'm talking about decision making frameworks. So if I'm making a decision about where to source a material for a computer, I want to think about all of the stakeholders, seen and unseen, known and unknown, in many generations down the line who could be affected by my choices today, which is why Indigenous people are extremely um, active in the anti-nuclear, anti-uranium um, conversation, because we know that it's our seven generations on our land in the future that is affected by uranium mining and uranium disposal. Um, so yeah, that's the other. There's lots of interesting perspectives on seven generations. The Initiative for Indigenous Futures held workshops on seven generation imagining, and one of the interesting concepts that came up is that seven generations could mean exactly seven down the line into the future, or that the person thinking about seven generations is a hinge between three generations before and three generations after, which is also a little easier to conceptualize because it is possible to know the direct stories, and even lives, and even know them in person, three generations before and three after. When I started to think about um, the role of indigenous philosophy on making decisions around computational practices, computational media, um, one of the things that we come up against is the extreme lack of diversity of thought in computation. It's a very monolithic field itself. And one challenge was to be able to articulate what we meant by ethics in conversations with people outside our community. And ethics as a field, as a field of law, is extremely complicated. And even more complicated is the fact that it doesn't translate perfectly from culture to culture and language to language. But one concept that I think is more easily applied is the idea of the good way, which is an English colloquial term in Lakota communities for saying that there is a path to do things in a way that honors seven generations, that is reciprocal from being to being, that holds a sense of responsibility for communities outside oneself. I mean, that's just my personal interpretation, because there's as many interpretations as people. But when applied to AI, AI being the nebulous, undefinable term for many computational fields at this point that aren't similar to each other. Uh, Thinking about how we can explain our very local, hyper local, even ideas about what is a reciprocal path forward, what's a path that doesn't create great harm to our communities, um, that is informed by the perspectives of our elders, perspectives of our children, uh, and that no tool should be made that affects our communities without the perspective of our communities. So that's kind of the way I employ the good way. Yeah, I think I also hear this term. I'd say I'm less in the world of environmental and sustainability than some, but I get pulled into conversations that engage with ideas of sustainability. But I always like to ground my thinking, again, in that term indigenous, which is a political term, where the word stewards, um, I think, softens political meaning and political gravity, and which is really important when taking in the idea of what an indigenous perspective is, because if we're to take seriously the role of indigenous perspectives on AI, as much as they will affect the how AI is created, the same thing is the same concept of taking seriously indigenous people's relationship with the earth and the land, where it can't just be a symbolic or acknowledged stewardship. It has to be a legal, um, political idea of indigenous sovereignty, political sovereignty, and ownership of land. Um, Legal and um, legal ideas around how our sovereignty affects our people is extremely important. So that's the same application into data sovereignty. So when we say that our indigenous people need to have sovereignty over their own data, they need to have data governance. That is what we mean, because if we want to apply our concepts like man is not the center of creation, we need to have the power to do that with our land and with our data.